Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are wading into, well, one of the most complex and I think difficult criminal cases in recent UK history. We're talking about the conviction of the former neonatal nurse, Lucy Letby.
It's a case that's really captured public attention, and for good reason. The details are profoundly disturbing.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're relying entirely on the public record, looking really closely at the timeline, the evidence that actually led to the conviction. And maybe more significantly now, this huge wave of professional and expert doubt that sprung up since the verdict.
Yeah, it's a really staggering situation because you're essentially asked to hold two kind of opposing ideas in your head at the same time.
What do you mean?
Well, you have the legal reality. Lucy Letby was convicted, found guilty of murdering 7 babies and trying to murder 7 others. This was all between June 2015 and June 2016 at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
And the sentence was historic, wasn't it? A whole life order.
Exactly. One of the most severe sentences possible in the UK. It makes her only the 4th woman in British legal history to receive one. So the court's view is unequivocal.
Right. So our aim here isn't to, retry the case or offer our own opinions. It's about using the sources to get past the headlines, the really emotional stuff.
Yeah, we need to unpack the specifics, the technical details the prosecution used, and then, really importantly, look hard at the specific evidence-based challenges that are now questioning the safety of those convictions. That's the legal term, right? The overall reliability.
That concept of safety, yeah, that feels crucial here because you've got this conviction based on what the jury clearly felt was compelling evidence, behavioral, circumstances.
Stuff that swayed them, definitely. But then on the other hand, you've got this almost backlash from parts of the scientific and medical community. They're systematically picking apart the medical evidence used in court.
It's quite the clash. Okay, let's unpack this then, starting, I guess, with her background. How does a seemingly normal nursing career take such a dark turn?
Well, Lucy Letby was born in Hereford back in January 1990. An only child, described as having a pretty normal, supportive upbringing.
And her reason for going into neonatal nursing?
She apparently cited gratitude. Said she'd had a difficult birth herself, and the nurses who cared for her inspired her. Felt she wanted to give back, help others in that vulnerable situation.
Okay, so she goes to university.
University of Chester, yes.
Yeah.
Specialized in child nursing, got her Bachelor of Science in nursing. But it wasn't entirely smooth sailing, even then.
Oh. What happened?
She actually failed her final student placement initially. She had to do what's called a retrieval placement, got a new assessor, and then she passed.
Interesting. And were there any other sort of flags early on?
There was one assessor back in 2011, a clinical skills tutor, Nicola Lightfoot. She noted concerns, described Letby as being a bit cold, and felt she lacked some clinical knowledge, particularly around medications.
Cold. That's a subjective word, but it sticks out given what happened later.
It does, perhaps. And when she got her job at the Countess of Chester Hospital, COCH, starting January 2012, her focus seemed to be very much on the intensive care side of things.
Right, the high-dependency babies.
Exactly. She apparently said she enjoyed seeing babies' progress, supporting families, the rewarding parts of the job. She even helped fundraise for a new unit. But colleagues later reported she found the non-intensive care work, looking after healthier babies. Well, boring was the word used.
She preferred the high stakes, maybe.
Seems that way. And that interest, maybe combined with that earlier noted lack of medication knowledge, did lead to some significant errors pretty early in her career. Errors that maybe weren't handled as strictly as they could have been.
You're talking about the 2013 morphine incident. Can you detail that?
Yeah, certainly. So July 2013, she's only been qualified about a year and a half. She and a more senior nurse made a mistake with a morphine infusion for a newborn. They set the rate 10 times higher than it should have been.
10 times? That's potentially catastrophic.
Absolutely. It was a very serious error. The hospital did act initially, suspending her temporarily from administering controlled drugs.
Okay, seems appropriate.
But Letby complained. She argued it was an overreaction, an escalation. And incredibly, the suspension was lifted just a week later.
A week after a tenfold overdose error.
Just a week. And that quick reversal, seemingly driven by her complaint, it sort of hints at this potential pattern, maybe, of management being perhaps more concerned with smoothing things over than with really strict clinical safety.
That institutional culture, that becomes absolutely vital when we get to 2015, doesn't it? Because that's when things really start to go wrong on the unit.
That's the absolute turning point. June 2015, suddenly the neonatal unit has 4 collapses and 3 of those babies die.
And the context for that is crucial. How many deaths would they normally expect?
Typically maybe 2 or 3 deaths in a whole year. So 3 deaths in 1 month alongside another collapse. That's a massive, massive spike.
And someone noticed the connection to Letby.
Dr. Stephen Breary, the lead consultant. He clocked that Letby had been on shift during all 4 incidents. But, initially he thought maybe it's just coincidence.
Why?
Well, partly because Letby often picked up extra shifts. The unit was chronically short-staffed, so she was there a lot anyway. It wasn't immediately obvious it was more than bad luck, combined with her shift patterns.
But the statistics kept getting worse, didn't they? The overall death rate.
Undeniably. There's a UK-wide project called MBR Race UK. They monitor maternity and newborn outcomes. Their reports showed that the death rate at the Countess of Chester neonatal unit was at least 10% higher than expected for the period June 2015 to June 2016.
10% higher than expected.
And in the calendar year 2015, the total number of neonatal deaths on that unit actually doubled compared to the year before. The data was practically screaming that something was terribly wrong.
Yet, management didn't react.
Incredibly, no, not substantively. By May 2016, almost a year after the spike began, the hospital's executive team apparently still considered it all just a coincidence. No major action taken.
So what finally pushed them?
It took Dr. Breary basically reaching breaking point. In June 2016, 2 more babies died right after Letby came back from a holiday. He went to the duty executive and absolutely demanded, that Letby be removed from clinical duties immediately.
And the executive initially refused. That resistance seems incredible.
It does. The duty exec apparently insisted she was safe to work. It really highlights this disconnect, this conflict between the clinical staff on the ground seeing the pattern and the management seemingly unwilling to accept it.
But she was eventually removed.
Yes, finally, in July 2016, she was moved off clinical duties. And the unit had to scale back its services too, stop taking babies born before 32 weeks because they just couldn't guarantee safety.
But the story with management doesn't end there. It actually gets worse in terms of how they handle the doctors who raised the alarm.
It really does. This part is genuinely shocking. After Letby was removed, she filed a formal grievance against the hospital in September 2016.
A grievance? For what?
Essentially claiming unfair treatment, that she'd been victimized. And the hospital board, unbelievably, sided with her to some extent. They concluded her removal had been orchestrated by the consultants, and there was no hard evidence against her at that point.
Orchestrated? Like it was some kind of conspiracy against her?
That seems to have been the implication. And it gets worse. The CEO of the hospital trust met with Letby and her parents in December 2016. He formally apologized to them on behalf of the entire trust.
Apologized to her?
Yes. And he reportedly promised them that the doctors who had raised the concerns, specifically mentioning Dr. Breary and another consultant, Dr. Ravi Jayaram, would be dealt with.
Dealt with. That sounds threatening.
It certainly does. And following that, those consultants were actually pressured into writing a formal letter of apology to Lucy Letby in February 2017.
They had to apologize to her for raising concerns about dying babies.
Correct. They put their necks on the line, tried to protect infants, and the system forced them to apologize to the person they suspected. It's a staggering example of institutional failure, possibly covering its own back.
So when did the police finally get involved? It seems like it took ages.
It did. It wasn't until March 2017. That's almost 2 years after the first cluster of deaths. The consultants, likely bolstered by advice from the regional neonatal lead, finally managed to persuade management that the police had to be called.
And Operation Hummingbird started when?
May 2017. The police investigation began. Initially, they looked at everything natural causes, maybe an infection outbreak, hospital-acquired viruses, before eventually focusing on the possibility of inflicted harm. That statistical anomaly just kept pointing towards her presence.
And that's where the expert witnesses come in, like Dewey Evans.
Exactly. Dewey Evans is a retired pediatrician. He became a key expert witness for the prosecution. He actually contacted the police himself, offering his expertise. He ended up reviewing dozens of cases, 61, I think.
And narrowed it down.
Yeah, eventually that review led to the specific charges brought against Letby. 22 counts in total, covering 17 different babies, designated baby A through Q for the trial, 7 counts of murder, and 15 of attempted murder.
Okay, so moving to the trial itself, which kicked off in October 2022, the prosecution had a huge job on their hands, didn't they? Trying to prove these incredibly technical, varied attacks without, a smoking gun or direct eyewitnesses to the acts themselves.
Absolutely. Their core argument really centered on the alleged methods Letby used. They proposed she used things like injecting air or insulin or overfeeding with milk, precisely because these methods are hard to detect afterward. They leave few traces, especially the air injection theories.
Right, they dissipate quickly. Can you run through the main methods they alleged?
Sure, it was quite a range. First, air embolism, injecting air directly into the bloodstream. Second, injecting air into the stomach via a nasogastric tube, the NG tube. Third, insulin poisoning, causing hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar. Fourth, deliberate overfeeding with milk or fluids. And in at least one case, they alleged physical trauma, causing a liver injury.
That variety itself was part of the argument, wasn't it? That switching methods showed calculation.
That's what the prosecution argued, yes, that it suggested a deliberate attempt to avoid detection by not sticking to one single identifiable method.
So, what was the key evidence they presented to back this up? It seems to fall into a few main camps. Statistics.
Yes, the statistics were huge for the prosecution. They put forward that shift chart, remember, showing Letby as the only nurse consistently present during, I think it was 25 specific incidents of death or sudden collapse they focused on.
And the argument was simple elimination.
Pretty much. The lead prosecutor, Nick Johnson, KC, essentially argued, look, she's the common denominator. By a process of simple elimination, it must be her. And they bolstered this by pointing out that the unusual number of deaths and collapses stopped almost immediately after Letby was removed from clinical duties in July 2016 and the unit was downgraded.
Okay, so the statistics formed one pillar. But the evidence that really seemed to grip everyone was the personal stuff found at her home, the notes.
Oh, absolutely. The handwritten notes became, I think, the psychological core of the prosecution's case. They were presented as the closest thing they had to an actual confession.
Can you remind us of some of those phrases? They were chillin'.
They really were. Written on sticky notes, bits of paper. Things like, I am evil, I did this, and I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them. Just devastating lines.
And that really ambiguous one, too.
Yes. I don't know if I killed them. Maybe I did. Maybe this is all down to me. It sounds like torment. But the prosecution framed it as consciousness of guilt.
But hang on. The defense had a counter to this, didn't they? How did they explain those notes?
They did, and it was a significant part of their case. They portrayed the notes not as confessions, but as, and this was their phrase, the anguished outpouring of a young woman in fear and despair.
Meaning, written because she was being investigated.
Exactly. Written while she was suspended, facing accusations, dealing with a professional fallout. They argued it was private journaling of extreme psychological distress, anxiety, self-doubt under immense pressure, not an admission of guilt to murder.
That's a very different interpretation. It really becomes a key battleground, doesn't it? Especially when you add in the other things found at her home.
Yeah, definitely. The police also found a significant number of confidential medical documents relating to the alleged victims. Handover sheets, records of resuscitation attempts, blood gas results. 21 documents in total, I think.
Where were they found?
Hidden under her bed.
Under her bed. What was her explanation for having those?
She claimed she just collected paper, that she was messy, and sometimes forgot to take hospital paperwork out of her pockets after shifts. An explanation the prosecution, unsurprisingly, painted as highly improbable, especially since a paper shredder was also found in her home.
And the diary entries.
Yes, her personal diaries also contained entries that seemed significant. She'd marked the initials of the babies who died or collapsed on the specific dates they were born, or attacked, or passed away.
Okay, so you have the stats, the notes, the documents, the diary. What about her behavior, her communications?
This was another major plank of the prosecution's case. They presented text messages she'd sent to friends and colleagues around the times of the incidents. They described her messages as almost live blogging the events, showing what they called an intrusive curiosity.
Any specific examples stand out?
There was one message she sent to the unit manager right after baby A died, offering to work more shifts, saying she needed to take an ITU baby soon. The prosecution implied this showed a desire, a compulsion almost, to be near the most vulnerable infants, the ones in intensive care.
And the timing of some messages seemed odd.
Yes, like messaging friends about winning money on the Grand National Horse Race, shortly after baby M had collapsed. It suggested a detachment, perhaps.
And the Facebook searching. That got a lot of attention.
It did. The prosecution highlighted that she had searched for the families of her alleged victims on Facebook 31 times, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes on significant dates like anniversaries, or even on Christmas Day.
How did the prosecution frame that?
They characterized it as almost sinister, like she was hunting for grief, deliberately looking for the aftermath of her actions.
And in her defense to that.
Her lawyers argued it was just general curiosity. They pointed out that in the same period, she'd searched for thousands of other people on Facebook, 2,287 times, apparently. So they tried to normalize it as just typical online behavior.
Still, 31 searches for the victims' families. It feels targeted. Was there any other testimony about her behavior?
There was one particularly damning piece. A doctor testified that about an hour before one of the babies died, Letby had made a comment to him, something like, "He's not leaving here alive, is he?"
Wow. That sounds incredibly premeditated, if true.
Exactly. It was presented as evidence of foresight, of intent.
So, faced with all this, the stats, the notes, the documents, the behavior, what was the core defense strategy? How did they try to counter it all?
Their main argument was essentially twofold. First, that Letby was actually a dedicated nurse who was being scapegoated for failures within the hospital system itself.
And second,
That the entire case against her was built purely on coincidence. The coincidence of her being present when these unfortunate but potentially natural or system-caused events happened.
so they really leaned into the hospital's problems.
Heavily. They made a big point about the known hygiene issues. Remember the plumber's testimony? He described frequent serious problems with sewage backing up into the sinks in the neonatal unit.
Right, suggesting infection risks.
Precisely. They argued these poor hygiene conditions, possibly linked to known bacteria like Pseudomonas found in hospital water systems sometimes, were a much more likely contributor to the increased death rate than the actions of one nurse. They also argued the medical evidence for things like air embolism was just too weak, too speculative, to even form the basis of a criminal case.
But they didn't call their own medical experts to refute the prosecution's experts in detail, did they? They mainly relied on Letby's own testimony and the plumber.
That's correct. It was a significant strategic decision. They challenged the prosecution's medical evidence through cross-examination and argued points of law about its sufficiency. But they didn't present a competing slate of medical experts. This decision looks perhaps even more critical now, given all the medical debate that erupted after the trial.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. So the judge allowed the medical evidence to go to the jury.
Yes, the trial judge rejected the defense arguments that the medical evidence was insufficient. He ruled there was a case to answer based on the expert opinions presented by the prosecution.
And the verdict came when?
August 2023. After a long trial, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 7 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. They couldn't reach verdicts on some other counts.
And the judge's reaction at sentencing?
The judge, Mr. Justice Goss, delivered incredibly strong sentencing remarks. He described Letby's actions as a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder. He spoke of deep malevolence bordering on sadism directed at the smallest, most vulnerable babies.
And that led to the whole life order, her reaction.
She refused to come to court for the sentencing hearing, just stayed in her cell. That decision caused widespread outrage and actually prompted the government to talk about new laws to compel offenders to attend their sentencing. It really cemented the public image of her, I think, as defiant and remorseless at that point.
Okay, now we pivot. Because despite that conviction, despite the judge's words, despite the whole life order, this is where it gets really interesting and really complex. Almost immediately after the verdict, serious, organized, professional doubt started to emerge.
That's right. And we're not talking about random bloggers or anything. This is coming from highly respected figures in neonatology, pathology, statistics, both in the UK and internationally.
And the core issue seems to be that challenge to the safety of the conviction, focusing specifically on the medical and statistical evidence that the jury relied upon.
Exactly. Because the defense didn't mount a full-scale medical counter-argument during the trial itself, the jury primarily heard the prosecution's interpretation of very complex medical events in premature babies. Once the reporting restrictions from the trial were lifted, experts who hadn't been involved started looking at the published evidence, and they began raising very specific, very pointed concerns.
Right, let's break those down. First, the claim about injecting air into the stomach via the NG tube. The prosecution said she killed 3 babies this way. Why are experts calling this nonsensical or not practically feasible?
Well, it boils down to basic infant physiology. To kill a baby quickly by forcing air into the stomach, you need to get a significant amount of air past the stomach, into the intestines, and then somehow into the bloodstream to cause an air embolism.
Which is hard.
extremely hard in a baby, according to these neonatologists. They argue you'd need to overcome the stomach's natural barriers, like the pyloric sphincter muscle. More likely, forcing that much air in would just cause the baby's stomach to swell up massively, causing visible distress or even a rupture rather than a sudden fatal collapse from air getting into the circulation that way. It just doesn't quite add up physiologically for a rapid death.
And didn't the prosecution's own main expert witness kind of backtrack on this point later?
This is a really crucial development. Dr. Dewey Evans, who was central to building the prosecution's medical case, stated post-trial that he no longer believes those specific babies were killed as a direct result of air being injected into their stomachs. That's a major admission, casting doubt on the very mechanism alleged for those counts.
Wow. And the later expert panel agreed.
Yes. The Lee expert panel, which we'll discuss more, reviewed all the evidence in 2025 and concluded there was actually no physical evidence found to suggest air had been forced down the NG tubes in those cases.
Okay, what about the insulin poisoning charges? Baby F and baby L, the evidence there rested on blood tests, right?
Yes, specifically on something called the C-peptide test. This test measures how much insulin the baby's own body is producing. The prosecution argued the results showed abnormally low C-peptide alongside low blood sugar, indicating external insulin must have been given.
But there are doubts about that test.
Serious doubts, particularly its reliability in very sick premature babies. Experts point out the C-peptide test is notoriously prone to errors and interference from other substances or conditions common in these infants. And crucially, the lab that did the testing actually recommended follow-up, confirmatory tests, if insulin poisoning was suspected.
And were those done?
No confirmatory tests were performed. So the conviction rests on a single, potentially unreliable test result.
And there were also questions about the amount of insulin needed.
Yes, this is another big challenge. Experts in pharmacology and chemical engineering looked at the likely doses. Professor Jeff Chase, for example, argued the prosecution significantly underestimated how much insulin Letby would have needed to inject to cause the effect seen, given the baby's rapid metabolism.
Meaning she'd have needed a lot.
A substantial amount, yes. Yet there was no evidence presented that large quantities of insulin were missing from the unit's stocks. So experts argue the test results might be explained by the baby's own physiological instability rather than poisoning.
Okay, let's move to the air embolism theory, injecting air directly into the blood. This seemed to rely heavily on doctors observing specific skin discolorations on the babies.
That's right. The prosecution linked these patchy, unusual skin markings to air embolism, partly based on a medical paper from 1989 written by Dr. Shu Lee.
But Dr. Lee himself objected to how his work was used.
He did, very publicly and very strongly after the trial. Dr. Lee is a world-renowned neonatologist. He stated that interpreting those skin patches as definitive proof of air embolism, essentially by ruling out other causes, was a fundamental mistake of medicine. Diagnosis by exclusion, he argued, is risky.
So just because you can't pinpoint another cause doesn't automatically make air embolism the right answer.
Exactly. He felt his 1989 paper was being misinterpreted. And to clarify, he actually updated his research later, explicitly stating that venous air embolism, the type alleged, has never been reliably documented in medical literature to cause the specific kind of patchy skin discoloration seen in these babies.
So the very sign they relied on, the expert says, isn't actually a sign of that specific cause.
Precisely. The Lee panel, drawing on this, concluded there was simply no reliable medical evidence to support the air embolism claims in Letby's case, and suggested other natural causes for the skin changes were more likely.
Okay, one more specific medical point. The liver injury in child O. The prosecution said it was caused by deliberate blunt force trauma.
Yes. They relied on the opinion of one expert pathologist who suggested intentional harm. However, the pathologist who originally performed the autopsy on child O did not suspect foul play. They thought it was due to natural causes or complications of resuscitation.
And other experts agreed with the original finding.
Yes, an independent senior pathologist reviewed the case files post-conviction and sided with the original pathologist, calling the prosecution expert's opinion of deliberate trauma naive, given the context of a very premature baby potentially undergoing vigorous resuscitation.
And the Lee panel's view.
They went further. They suggested the liver injury was highly likely related to a potentially traumatic delivery, possibly made worse if a doctor accidentally punctured the liver during an emergency procedure, like inserting an umbilical line, something that can happen. They found the idea of Letby inflicting blunt force trauma implausible in the circumstances.
So the big picture on the medical side seems to be the original doctors and pathologists at the time didn't suspect murder. The diagnoses of harm were made later by external experts, based partly on the pattern, and now those interpretations are being heavily challenged by other experts.
That's a fair summary of the core medical controversy, yes. Statistical and data challenges.
Now let's talk about the statistics. That shift chart showing Letby was always present seems so damning. But statisticians have raised red flags.
Big red flags. Several have criticized the prosecution's approach, accusing them of falling into logical traps. Specifically, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy and the prosecutor's fallacy.
Okay, you need to break those down for us. What's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy?
Imagine someone firing a shotgun randomly at the side of a barn, then walking up and drawing a bullseye around the tightest cluster of pellet holes, claiming they're a great shot. That's the fallacy. Applied here, critics say the prosecution selected specific incidents after the fact, the ones Letby was present for, and created a pattern out of them, potentially ignoring other collapses or relevant data points that didn't fit the narrative. They drew the target around the existing holes.
Okay, makes sense. And the prosecutor's fallacy. That sounds important.
It is. It's a very common mistake in legal settings. It's by confusing two different probabilities. The prosecution might say the probability of Letby being present for all these events just by chance is incredibly small, say 1 in a million. Then they imply, therefore, the probability that she is innocent must also be 1 in a million.
But that doesn't follow logically.
No, because it ignores other factors. What's the prior probability? How often did other nurses work similar shifts? Crucially, what if the events themselves weren't random acts of harm, but had a common underlying cause, like an infection outbreak? If the events aren't independent, the whole calculation falls apart. It wrongly equates the rarity of the data given innocence with the probability of innocence given the data.
So the shift chart itself, the one used for that simple elimination argument, it was flawed.
Critics argue it was deeply misleading. It focused only on Letby, excluding other staff who might have been present. It didn't properly show how often other nurses worked similar shifts, which is vital context. And remember Jane Hutton.
The statistician the police hired early on?
Yes. Her line of inquiry, which might have provided a more balanced statistical picture, was dropped by the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS. She now publicly states that the statistical evidence presented at trial does not hold water.
And wasn't there also an issue with the actual data itself? Something about door swipes?
Yes, another blow to data integrity. The CPS had to admit, after the trial, that electronic door swipe records for one key entrance to the unit had been misinterpreted. Entries were recorded as exits, and exits as entries.
Oh, dear. Did that affect the guilty verdicts?
Well, the CPS claimed it was only directly relevant to the case of child K, one of the babies Letby was actually acquitted of harming. But the fact remains that this faulty, reversed data was still presented as evidence relating to 9 different babies during the trial. It just raises serious questions about the overall care taken with the data underpinning the prosecution's case, institutional failures, and external factors.
It feels like we can't separate the deaths from the context of the hospital itself at that time. The defense pointed to systemic failures, right?
Absolutely. And independent sources seem to back this up. The New Yorker magazine did a deep dive highlighting really pervasive problems: chronic staffing shortages, not enough specialist doctors available, and those serious recurring hygiene issues.
The sewage in the sinks again?
Yes. The plumber's testimony wasn't just anecdotal. It pointed to a potentially dangerous environment for highly vulnerable premature babies. A unit struggling with basic sanitation is obviously at higher risk of infections.
And then there's the bacterial outbreak revelation. That wasn't mentioned at trial at all.
Not mentioned. This came out via a leaked internal hospital report in August 2024. It revealed the unit was suffering an outbreak of dangerous bacteria, potentially Serratia marcescens, though details are guarded during the very periods Letby was working and the deaths were spiking.
And experts think this could explain the deaths.
Several medical microbiologists, like Professor David Livermore, have suggested this outbreak offers a much simpler, more plausible explanation for a sudden cluster of deaths and collapses in fragile babies than the actions of a single nurse using varied, hard-to-detect methods. The fact this outbreak wasn't part of the trial evidence is seen by critics as a massive omission.
Wasn't there also an official review of the unit back in 2016?
Yes. The Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, RCPCH, conducted a review. They concluded staffing levels and leadership on the unit were inadequate. They actually described Letby positively in their report: enthusiastic, capable, and committed. But their main finding pointed towards systemic and managerial failings.
So you have multiple sources pointing to a unit in crisis.
Exactly. And the failure of hospital management not just to address these issues, but to actively push back against the doctors raising alarms about Letby. It fuels this ongoing debate. Was this a case of murder? Or was it catastrophic systemic failure where blame got focused, perhaps wrongly, on one individual post-conviction legal landscape?
Despite all these scientific and systemic questions, Letby hasn't had much success through the standard legal channels so far, has she?
No, her initial attempts to appeal the convictions were refused. She lost 2 applications for permission to appeal. And then there was a retrial on 1 count of attempted murder where the first jury couldn't decide.
And she was convicted on that count, too.
Yes, in July 2024. So legally, through the conventional court routes, the verdicts have stood.
But the scrutiny hasn't stopped. There's a big public inquiry.
Correct. The government launched what's called a statutory inquiry, the Thirlwall Inquiry. It started public hearings in September 2024. The key thing about it being statutory is that it has legal powers to compel witnesses to testify under oath.
So it can force managers and doctors to give evidence.
Exactly. It's designed to get to the bottom of all the circumstances surrounding the deaths and the hospital's response, focusing heavily on management accountability.
And what's come out of the inquiry so far? Has it supported the prosecution or the doubts?
Well, some testimony has definitely reinforced the prosecution's narrative about Letby's behavior. Colleagues have testified again about her seeming excited or gossipy around the time of collapses, and repeated the claim she found caring for less sick babies boring. So it's adding to that behavioral picture.
But the biggest challenge to the convictions came from outside the inquiry, didn't it? The Lee expert panel.
Yes, this was hugely significant. Dr. Shu Lee, the neonatologist whose work was debated during the trial, convened his own panel in 2025. 14 top international medical experts reviewed all 22 cases charged against Letby.
And their conclusion.
It was absolutely explosive. They concluded, unanimously, that there was no medical evidence to support claims that Letby deliberately harmed or murdered babies. Full stop.
No medical evidence at all. So what did they think caused the deaths?
They attributed the deaths and collapses to a combination of factors: natural causes in very premature infants, undiagnosed infections linking back potentially to that outbreak, and critically, instances of substandard medical care by the hospital system.
Wow, that's a direct contradiction of the trial outcome.
A complete and direct contradiction coming from a panel of leading global specialists in the field.
And this finding immediately led to Letby's next legal step.
Yes. Coinciding with the release of the Lee panel's findings in February 2025, Letby's legal team formally applied to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC.
What does the CCRC do?
The CCRC is the independent body in the UK set up specifically to investigate potential miscarriages of justice. They review convictions after the normal appeal process is exhausted. They have the power to look at new evidence or arguments like the Lee panel report and decide whether the case should be sent back to the Court of Appeal because the conviction might be unsafe.
So the CCRC is now looking at everything, the medical doubts, the statistics, the outbreak.
Precisely. Their investigation is ongoing. It's a thorough, independent review process, separate from the courts, designed specifically for complex situations like this where significant new doubts have emerged about the safety of a conviction. Their decision will be...
So where does this leave us? I mean, the Lucy Letby case is it's one of the most difficult and frankly troubling situations imaginable in legal and medical worlds.
It really is. You have this stark contrast. On one side, a jury verdict, guilty, backed up by evidence that clearly resonated with them. The handwritten notes, the pattern of her presence, the Facebook searches, her reported attitude, stuff that painted a very disturbing picture.
Evidence that led to one of the harshest sentences possible, a whole life order. The judge clearly had no doubt.
None expressed, certainly. But then on the other side, you have this formidable growing body of expert opinion, particularly from the medical and statistical fields, who are systematically taking apart the very foundations of that conviction.
They're questioning the diagnoses, right? Saying the air embolism theory doesn't hold up, the insulin evidence is weak, the statistics were misused.
Exactly. And they're pointing instead towards those systemic factors. The chaos in the hospital, the poor management, the staffing issues, and crucially, that potential bacterial outbreak that wasn't even discussed at trial. They're offering an alternative explanation for the tragedy.
And the fallout from the hospital management side is already significant, isn't it? Calls for reform, arrests.
Huge fallout. There are widespread calls now to regulate NHS managers, much like doctors and nurses are regulated, to ensure accountability. And significantly, in July 2025, 3 former senior managers from the Countess of Chester were actually arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. Plus, there's an ongoing corporate manslaughter investigation into the hospital trust itself. It shows how seriously the institutional failings are now being taken.
So at the end of the day, you have this intense tension. Persuasive circumstantial evidence versus profound scientific and statistical challenges.
That's the crux of it. Despite the legal finality of the conviction and sentence so far, the scientific community's fierce debate, especially after the Lee panel's devastating critique, means the core question remains wide open for many.
Was this a calculated campaign of murder by a nurse, as the jury found? Or was it a perfect storm of coincidence, systemic failure, poor care, maybe an infection outbreak that tragically led to these deaths and resulted in a nurse being wrongly convicted?
And until the CCRC completes its review and decides whether to refer the case back to the courts, that fundamental uncertainty is likely to persist. The debate certainly isn't over.
Which means this deep dive really is just scratching the surface of a case that continues to evolve. We definitely encourage you, the listener, to keep an eye on the ongoing Thirlwall inquiry and, perhaps most importantly, await the findings of the Criminal Cases Review Commission.